recognize. And also, this has been such a strange 12 to 13 months that I feel like a lot of you don't really know me either. You hear me, but you don't really know me. My name is Mary Sims. I have been at St. Brendan now since the fall of 2019, but most of that has been underground and locked down and whatnot. So we see halves of each other's faces, and some of you I know from other programs as well. I came here after working in the Archdiocese for 5 years at a couple of other parishes in the Seattle Archdiocese. Prior to that, I lived in Spokane, Washington for a few years. That's where I got my bachelor's and master's degrees, my BA from Gonzaga, which is how I know John over there, and then my master's from Eastern Washington University in choral conducting, vocal performance at Gonzaga. I studied chant at Gonzaga with my advisor, Dr. Ed Schaefer, who has gone on to publish several books on Gregorian chant and do his own thing now. He's not even in Spokane anymore. And I studied choral conducting under Dr. Randall Wagner at Eastern Washington University. So then I came to the Seattle Archdiocese and began working in parishes. I have done something like this at every parish that I've been at. And I have also done something like this as a guest at other parishes in the Seattle Archdiocese. So if I ever get to a point of saying something or using a term that you don't understand or are confused by, please interrupt and ask. We're not going to do a Q&A at the end. We're just going to do questions as we go. I think that's an easier way to kind of keep the momentum going and make sure that everybody's tracking. So it's been a real pleasure to be here at St. Brendan and be able to do a lot of the singing for the masses, but it's also been very strange, as you all know, because nobody's allowed to join in, and that's been very odd. What we're going to be talking about tonight is the general scope and sequence of Gregorian chant in the liturgy of the Mass in particular, outside of COVID. So obviously we're dealing with all the COVID regulations and whatnot, and I'm happy to address questions pertaining to that if they're pertinent. But what we're looking at is sort of what this all looks like liturgically outside of the constraints that we are currently under. So first things first, what is chant? Let me ask another question actually first, just for my own reference. Raise your hand if you are a musician, even on a sort of amateur level, if you've sung in choirs before, played a musical instrument of any kind at any point in time. Okay, so most of us. Okay, good. We're going to deal a little bit with some musical notation, kind of talking that language a little bit, but I'm going to try to keep things really, really general. So chant itself, if we are going to define Gregorian chant specifically, there's a few things that come to mind. First of all, a cappella is generally an understood feature of Gregorian chant, meaning there's no accompaniment. Chant can be accompanied, but that came much, much, much later. Gregorian chant is not accompanied. It's also a single melody, a single melodic line. There are no harmonies done by the participating singers. If there are a large group of singers singing a line of chant, they're all singing the same line. Okay, so those are two distinguishing features. Also, Gregorian chant, when we use the term Gregorian to describe the chant, we're talking about Latin. Okay, so Latin, a single melodic line, or monophonic is the fancy term for that, and also a cappella. Where does Gregorian chant come from? Well, in the Christian church, when we began using chant in the very early centuries of church liturgy, a lot of it was borrowed from our Jewish fathers and chants that you would hear at synagogue. So really, a lot of the idea of even chanting in the liturgy comes directly from our Jewish forefathers. I want to direct your attention. Hopefully all of you have a fairly thick handout. So I'm going to direct your attention to the first couple of images in your handout. The cover page, if you will, is Puer Natus. This is the entrance antiphon, to use a newfangled term, the entrance antiphon for Christmas Day. And you can kind of make out the ginormous P that's actually illuminated, right? Lots and lots of design along the letter P that stretches along the width of the page. And then Poractus, it says right there across the top. Now, what are we looking at above the text? We can make out the text more or less. And then we're looking at humps, dots, squiggles. Lots of chicken scratch almost. These are our very first examples of written neumes, which will be our first word to learn. When we're speaking the chant lingo, we don't really refer to them as notes. We call them neumes. Okay, so what we're looking at, these dots, these squiggles, these like humps, those are all examples of neumes, and they're all indicative of how this melody is supposed to go. Obviously, to our eye now, it doesn't make any sense. But these are really more reminders than they are actual concrete notes. Yes? This is French, actually. Yeah. To throw a total wrench in it. Our earliest examples of chant primarily come from France and Switzerland. So a lot of our terminology ends up coming from France as well when it comes to a lot of this. But Latin is a decent guess when all else fails in Catholic trivia stuff. Okay, so this example here, this Poractus, comes from the 9th century. Okay, that's where it's been dated back. If you flip the page over, you'll see the one and only color image in the entire handout, because I'm cheap. And you'll notice probably the biggest difference, because we still have the dots, we still have the squiggles, we still have all that chicken scratch, but the biggest difference is what? Lines. All of a sudden we have lines, okay? So we see the beginning of what we now call a staff in music. Here, this is 12th century. This is Auspicians, which is the responsory for Matins and the first Sunday of Advent. So this is part of the divine office, not the Mass. You'll also notice, and this is why the color copy was important, you'll also notice that one of the lines is red. So for those of us that know this sequence, tell me if this rings a bell. Most of us know that from Sound of Music, if nothing else. So the red line is fa, and that tells us where fa is, which gives us at least some sort of frame of reference for everything else that is on the page. Any questions about either of those examples, the little 9th, the little 12th century? Yes? This is called solfege, yes. And we're going to come back to this quite a bit. So if you want to write it out, write out the sequence. We'll come back to it. I may erase and write it out again just because it's so much fun. We'll come back to that. Good. Yes, John? In the 12th century, more or less, yes. Yes. I don't know that this example is the very first staff, but yes. Yeah, so, and the staff became fairly mainstream as far as music writing goes by the 13th century, certainly, because then we do see the introduction of harmonies, and so the staff becomes more important for that reason, too. It's worth mentioning, when you're looking at this and wondering, how is everybody reading this and knowing what to do, that obviously in the 9th and 12th century, we don't have the printing press yet. So where you're going to see and hear this music sung are going to be primarily in monasteries and convents. And so the scores, the actual copies of, for example, this, would be in a rather enormous book that would then be laid out so that the community could gather round, very, very not socially distanced, and read from this giant page and all sing together, okay? So these serve as melodic reminders for a community that is all singing off of the same sheet of paper because it's all written out by hand. Okay? All right, next page, and this is where I began my very fancy advanced numbering system. Page 1. Christus factus est. This is our responsory for Good Friday. We'll also hear it actually this Sunday as the verse before the gospel, the same text. But what I wanted to really draw your attention to here is the fact that now we see a definitive 4-line staff. We also see what looks a lot more like notes to our eyes, and probably to any of us that have seen chant ever before, we at least recognize, oh, there's some square blocks. I've seen that before. But you'll notice that those little squiggles, we've got a set above the staff and a set below the staff. The set above is from Lyon in northern France. The set of squiggles and notations and neumes below is from Senegal. And both of these would be roughly, again, 9th to 12th century. Fun fact that a lot of people don't realize, they see the square note notation, which is actually very creatively what we call it, square note notation. Lots of imagination over here. Vatican notation is another term. Most people don't realize that the Vatican notation, square note notation, only developed in the 19th century. It is very, very recent. Prior to that, people were still reading off of these neumes from the likes of Lyon and Senegal. Good, so let's quickly just cover, since I've got this up here already, cover one fact of this Christus factus est. On that 4-line staff, you'll notice at the top line, at the very beginning of every system, there's like a hook, if you will, that covers that top line. Do you all see what I'm talking about? Looks kind of like this, over the line. Right? That's do. That's do. So that tells you where do is. Now notice I'm not giving you any note names because that's not part of chant at all. Do is what we call movable, which means if I wanted to sing this by myself, because I'm a soprano, I might start on something like maybe a G. But if I was maybe directing a men's choir that wanted to sing this, I could also start on, let's say, a D as a pitch, because do is movable. So the intervals, the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, those intervals stay the same, even though the pitch can be moved, the starting pitch. And for those of you that are more familiar with solfege, you probably might recall that everything in this arrangement is a whole step with 2 exceptions. So those 2 are half steps between mi and fa and ti and do. I'll show you what I mean. COVID regulations have me over here for singing, just in case you were wondering. So here we go. Do, re, that's a whole step. Re, mi, whole step. Mi, fa, first half step. Fa, sol, whole, sol, la, whole, la, ti, whole, ti, do. There's our other half step, okay? So as long as you know where do is on your staff, everything else is just related from that, right? Questions on this so far? Okay, good. So that kind of covers a little bit of the evolution of chant notation up to what we now know as square note chant notation. So if you can turn now to page 3. 2 is blank, but there is a little number 2, if you must know. Okay. So you can see the do clef right up there at the top. We do have one other kind of clef, the fa clef. Okay, so those are the only two clefs you have in chant, either identifying do or identifying fa. The do clef is far more popular, more frequently seen in chant than the fa clef, but they're both possible. And again, everything from there is relational. And then you've just basically got a lot of different types of neumes. These would all be called neumes, whether there's groups of 2 or 3. And you'll notice that chant typically is broken up into groups of 2s and 3s. You can almost always take a phrase and pick it apart and separate it into those sorts of groups. And we're going to come back to this notation, but first I want to kind of get into the thick of what we're going to be dealing with. You can take chant, and the liturgy for that matter, and break it into 2 major categories: the Mass and the Divine Office. We don't have time to talk about the Divine Office tonight. We're just going to be dealing primarily with the Mass, okay? So the Mass itself, when you're looking at music and chant parts, can be divided into 2 sections. And I'm going to write this out on the board. How many of you are familiar with these terms in the context of the Mass? Good, 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 good. All right, yeah, all right, good. So we'll blast right through this. This will be no problem. The ordinary is that part, those parts, I should say, those parts of the Mass that never change. They're ordinary. They're always there. They're always a part of the Mass. The propers are that which is proper to the day or the feast. So they're the parts that change. So again, because we're not talking about really much to do with the spoken material, we're focusing on the musical and sung material. Let's go ahead and break it down. Can somebody give me, from this group, an example of one of the pieces of the ordinary? Say that again, louder. Songtooth. Okay, we've got the Sanctus, we've got the Agnus Dei. Next. Okay, next. Credo. What else? I was just going to say, what about the one we're not singing right now? Although today, got to sing it today, if you went to Mass for the Feast of the Annunciation. It's one of only 2 days in all of Lent, St. Joseph and the Annunciation. This basically covers it. I'm going to throw in one more. The Our Father. If you're wondering why I threw that in there, I'll explain in a minute. Okay, moving over, really quickly, sorry. All of this is obviously in Latin, except the Kyrie, which is in Greek. Oh my gosh, you guys are all experts already. What are we doing here? Okay, the proper, examples of the proper, again, remembering that these would be the sung parts. So you could, for example, say the gospel and you would be right because the gospel does change from one day to the next, but typically speaking, the priest is not chanting the gospel. So, sung. Oh, are you looking ahead? entrance antiphon, which, if we're sticking with kind of the Gregorian terminology, entrance antiphon is also called the introit. The gospel acclamation, which is that bad word that we can't say right now. But I can write it. I just don't say it. Don't tell Father. Okay, what else? Well, and also, if we're talking about Gregorian, obviously this would not happen during Lent, as we know. So in Gregorian chant, it is the tract. We just call it now the gospel acclamation or the verse before the gospel. Either of those are appropriate. Okay, what else? Yep. Communion, and then what's the other antiphon? Yeah. Okay. What about before the gospel? Yep. So in Gregorian chant, it's the gradual. Now we generally do the responsorial psalm. And we do include this because the instructive from the Roman Missal is that whenever possible, the psalm is to be sung. So that almost always would apply. Yeah, so there we go. So that breaks down basically our propers that are sung. Okay? So, why? This is one of my best friends. This is called the Roman Missal. It's got everything you could possibly imagine. Most of it pertains to the priest, not to us, not to me. But it's got all the Eucharistic prayers. It's got every collect for every feast, Sunday, you name it, is all in here. And the section that comes before the Roman Missal, the bulk of the Roman Missal, is called the general instruction of the Roman Missal, which, now that we're, mid-pandemic, isn't as funny anymore, but we call it the germ. And it has every little nitty-gritty detail you could possibly imagine. I mean, the stuff that would probably bore everybody to pieces. But it's where you go when you've got questions. How do I do this? What do I do? Where does this go? Etc. So, well, first of all, I promised an explanation for the Paternoster over there. So, number 41 in the germ. Since the faithful from different countries come together ever more frequently, it is desirable that they know how to sing together at least some parts of the ordinary of the Mass in Latin, especially the profession of faith, the Credo, and the Lord's Prayer, the Paternoster. We don't do either of those here, and most places don't. The Credo is so long that if you go too slow, you're here till Tuesday. And the Paternoster is not as familiar to people either. But the general instruction does say that those are the parts that are bare minimum should be familiar to the congregation. Then you skip ahead to number 48, and this is instructions regarding the entrance itself. And it speaks specifically about the entrance chant, is how it's described. The entrance chant begins as the priest enters with the deacon and the ministers. The chant is sung alternately by the choir, cantor, people. It gives all sorts of options for there, or even the choir alone. In the Diocese of the United States of America, there are 4 options for the entrance chant: the antiphon from the Missal, or the antiphon with its psalm from the Graduale Romanum as set to music, the antiphon and psalm from the Graduale Simplex, a simpler version of the Romanum, chant from another collection of psalms or antiphons approved by the Conference of Bishops, or another liturgical chant that is suited to the sacred action. So those are the 4 options that are given. Now, option 1, which says take the chant from the Roman Missal, is always going to be the preferred option because, as with almost everything else in the Catholic Church, these lists are hierarchical. So number 1 is the preferred, number 2 if one doesn't work out, and so you go down the line, okay? All right, and then skipping over to number 74. 74 specifically says the procession bringing the gifts is accompanied by the offertory chant, which continues at least until the gifts have been placed on the altar. Number 86. While the priest is receiving the sacrament, the communion chant is begun. Okay? So that covers those 3 major antiphons that you hear me singing during the Mass. Any questions on those or the general instruction? This is a good wait. Catherine? That was number 41. She was, sorry, thank you. I need to remember to do that. Catherine was asking which of the instructions dealt with the faithful learning the Pater Noster and the Credo, and it is number 41. Good. Yes. I took this off the altar. I would pass it around normally, but I don't think I'm allowed to do that under the current conditions. But yes, I think you could take a peek at it. You know, I don't know, honestly. Bridget, do you know? Yeah, I would also, if you're interested specifically in the germ, you can get that on its own as a PDF online. Yeah. Almost everything that we're talking about tonight you can get in some form online, and the germ is one of those too. I printed off a version a few weeks ago just to kind of mark it up because I don't want to write all over the Missal. So yeah, good question though. Other questions? Oh yeah! Go, Bridget. Right, okay, so this is an issue that boils down to the Roman Missal. Oh, sorry, thank you. Bridget's asking, she's in her personal Missal that she has, and this is probably true for those of you that use the Magnificat, or if you also have maybe an app that you use on your phone or tablet to follow along with the Mass propers. You inevitably will see the entrance antiphon, and you will also see the communion antiphon. It's fairly rare that you will have the offertory antiphon written in front of you. And Bridget's question is, why? And it's a very good question. And it has to do with the fact that after Vatican II, the expectation became that the faithful would at the very least speak the antiphons if they were not going to be sung, but not the offertory. So the faithful, so for example, at a daily Mass, the faithful, or at least one person, half the time it's Father, I think, will speak the entrance antiphon and the communion antiphon. But just because of the nature of what's happening at the altar during offertory, the offertory antiphon will not be spoken. If the offertory cannot be sung, it's omitted. And so for that reason, it's not included in the books that are mainly accessible to the faithful, because they would not normally be doing that unless it's being sung. So in the Roman Missal, you've got the offertory antiphon, and in any of the musical books, you'll find the offertory antiphon, but not for that which is to be spoken by the general faithful. Make sense? Yes. Yes. Sure. Yes, so there is, and this goes back to the Gregorian origins of the English chants that I'm singing at Mass. There is a psalm attached to the introit, and there is a psalm attached to the communion chant. And so what I'm singing are those verses from those psalms, that correspond with either the introit or the communion, and always ending with the doxology. But those come from the Latin, the original Latin. The communion psalm verses are extensive. The introit, the original introit verse would usually only be one psalm verse, and then you go to the doxology, but that's because the Gregorian introit is significantly longer than the English entrance antiphon, like by 3 or 4 times. So you wouldn't really need a whole bunch of verses to occupy time. Good, that's a good question. Any other questions? No? Okay. Well, let's get into a little bit more of the nuts and bolts of chant and chant notation. So, tell you what, we'll leave the ordinary up. Before we get into the different kinds of neumes, there are basically 3 general styles of Gregorian chant, and they have to do with the number of notes, if you will, per syllable. And this will all kind of make sense as we go through some of the music in this handout too. The first style applies to chant in which you would generally have 1 note per syllable, and we call that, very, very imaginatively, syllabic chant. Okay, so if in your handout you take a peek at page 9, the first couple of phrases of the Gloria are the very definition of syllabic chant. 1 pitch per syllable. Pretty straightforward. You will generally, when you have a bunch of text in a chant, like the Gloria, or if you flip the Gloria page over and look at the Creed, you'll have a lot of syllabic chant because you've got to move the thing along. There's a lot of text to get through. Okay? The next kind basically applies to chant that has between 3 to maybe 5 neumes per syllable. And again, because we're very inventive, pneumatic chant. So you'll actually see bits of pneumatic chant in the Gloria as well, back on page 9. Laudamus, adoramus, Deus Pater omnipotens, qui tollis peccata mundi, that word. You'll see between roughly 3 to 5 neumes, sometimes 2, and that's pneumatic chant, okay? Just a little bit more going on per syllable. And then finally, a lot of people, when they think of chant, they think of this third style, which is when you have roughly 782 notes per syllable. And that is melismatic chant, which gets its name from melisma, with a melisma being that 782 notes in a syllable. You just call the whole thing a melisma. Let's look at an example, page 8. Let's sing it. I'll sing this for you. Kyrie eleison. Got some melismas. Okay. So, do the styles of chant correspond with propers and ordinaries? Yeah, quite a bit. As I mentioned, when you have a lot of text, you'll tend to see a lot of syllabic chant going on. But it also matters whether the chant is meant to be sung by maybe a small schola or a cantor even, so a small group of singers or a single singer versus the congregation as a whole. It also might have to do with what's happening during the Mass. So for example, is there a procession going on, like at the entrance, or communion typically would be a procession, not right now obviously, but normally there's a procession up to communion. Or is it more like with the offertory where the faithful are seated and it's a contemplative moment while the altar is prepared for the sacrifice, for the liturgy of the Eucharist. You'll see more melismatic chants when that is the case, when it is meant to be more contemplative in nature, like with the offertory. So for example, turn now to, you're going to jump ahead a little bit, to number 19. And there's the offertory chant for today, actually, the Gregorian Chant for the Feast of the Annunciation on page 19. And you'll see a lot of melismas. Very, very florid and effusive. And again, because we know that the faithful typically during the offertory are seated, and while the prayers are obviously accompanying the action at the altar, only the priest is engaging in that action and the altar servers. The rest of us as faithful are listening and absorbing and praying. Okay, so now let's go ahead and jump back over to page 3, just to kind of blast through some of these notations and maybe address any kind of confusion that might come along the way. So if you are a music reader, on page 3, you'll notice in the right column some somewhat corresponding, more familiar notation on a 5-note staff with 1/8 notes. But on the left, that's what we're going to look at. So let's start, let's see, what is that? 5 down, the bistropha, when you have 2 notes, 2 punctums that are sung right next to each other. Those are actually separated. Those are sung as 2 separate notes, just repeated, okay? So there are some people that think of it as, oh, I'm just gonna hold this longer. That's not the way that was intended. That is intended to be sung as 2 separate notes. They just are the same. They're the same pitch. Next one down, Poractus. You don't really need to remember all of these fancy names, but it's good to know what it means. When 2 square notes are stacked one on top of the other, regardless of distance, if they are stacked directly on top of each other, you always start with the bottom and then move up to the top. Okay? No, for a Poractus, you'll only see the 2. And it's always low, high. An example of this is on page 7. Which is a much more simple setting of the Kyrie than the one I just sang earlier. Kyrie eleison. So you have the Poractus on re of Kyrie, and then you have the bistropha on a. Did you hear me separate that just a little bit? It's not a total divorced separation, it's just a slight pulse. I'll do it again. Kyrie eleison. So low, high, re. And then you'll notice it again on Christe, right? The Christe, the first syllable starts up high, but then you've got another Poractus, and yet again, that would be low to high. Christe eleison, right? And then again, Kyrie eleison. Okay? Okay, so that's one that people often get confused about because it is odd to see 2 notes right on top of each other. So again, regardless of distance, you always start at the bottom. Okay, the next one looks like a couple of descending stairs, the clevis. Again, this can be regardless of distance. It doesn't matter, but you go from high to low. But this makes a lot more sense because it is in that order, high, low, right? Good. The next one down is one of my favorites, a liquescent note. This is also, it's very easy to be thrown off by these because you've got a regular size punctum and then you've got this little teeny tiny kind of hook guy hanging out. That's actually a note, and that is sung as a note. There is a performance practice technique with liquescent notes of grabbing the consonant that is closest to it and singing on it. So, as an example, turn to page 12, the Sanctus from the Missa de Angelis. And you'll notice on the first two Sanctuses, sancti, yeah, the first syllable on both, you've got liquescent notes. You see those little hooks? Okay, so what I would do then in that case, because of the liquescent note, is I would sing ever so slightly on the N of Sanctus. It's very nuanced, something that's not necessarily the most noticeable thing in the world, but it sounds like this. Sanctus. Just a little bit on that end. Did you hear it? Sanctus, sanctus. And that's what it's there for. It is a note. You sing it. It doesn't get any less value just because it's smaller in size. It's a good life lesson for all of us. So it still has equal value, but it does generally, it tells you, hey, look at that consonant and sing a little bit on there. Okay? Good. So moving along, there's ascending three notes. Remember how I mentioned typically in chant, we're looking at groups of twos or threes, okay? Almost everything can be broken down into groups of twos or threes. Next one after that is another just hilarious one, Chalisma, okay? The Chalisma is a set of three notes, and the middle one looks like someone took a bite out of it. Like they just got really hungry and started eating their music. And so there's a lot of different ways to describe it. Took a bite out of it, yes. So also a note. It is also sung, so this is a three-note figure. However, what the Chalisma means is that the note preceding it is held. So the very beginning note of the Chalisma would actually be held longer, and then you move right through. So, find an example of, I'm getting my notes all out of order. Let's see here. If I can find one. Oh, yeah, but that's a word I can't say. It's not going to work. Oh, here we go. If you go to page 21, second line down, there's two Chalismas, one on Eus and one right in the middle of Emmanuel. Do you see that? So, 21 is where we're at right now. So the first note of Eus I'm holding because it is the note immediately before the Chalisma. I'll sing it again. And then Emmanuel. Okay, so in both cases, the note prior to the Chalisma is the note that's held. Got it? Yeah, question? Correct. Yes. You just breeze right through it just like anything else. There are three ways of extending a note in chant. One is a dot, one is a line, and the third is the Chalisma. okay? And you'll notice sometimes we've got dots, sometimes we have lines, sometimes it's a chalisma. A chalisma is always that 3-note figure, though, right? Whereas a line or a dot will be over an individual punctum, okay? Good. When you have 3 notes going low, high, low, we call that a torculus. You can see that down. We're getting towards the bottom of page 3 now. A torculus, low, high, low. Now, it doesn't matter how low, how high, or how low. And in fact, when you return back to your 3rd pitch, the low one, you don't have to return to the exact same pitch. It just needs to be that group of 3, low, high, low. So in our example, the 3rd and final note of the torculus is the lowest of them all, right? You can see examples of, let's find one for you. Oh, that's the other one I meant to mention with the chalisma, sorry. In the Mysterium Fidei, because we sing that on a regular basis, on the word Domine is a chalisma. So we always hold that first note of Domine. Yep. I totally forgot I was going to mention that. Okay, page 16. This is the Agnus Dei from the Missa de Angelis. And we have a torculus on mundi and nobis in both cases. Well, mundi in all 3 cases, and then also pacem, right? So, qui talis peccata mundi, lo, high, low, miserere nobis, lo, high, low. Okay? Okay. And then oh, yes, go ahead. Yes. Uh-huh. Where are you looking exactly? Oh, yes. All right. Thank you. That's a good question. One sec. Pat is pointing out that in the Agnus Dei, where we were just singing, the second line down, the final syllable of miserere, that he noticed what looks like it could be a note that's not filled in. Do you all see that? It's almost like it looks like this. Right? Does that look familiar to you? It is. It 100% is. Yeah. So the question is, what is that little B, right? But we know, Quinn, you know what those little B's are in music, right? Flats. Yes. So what does a flat do? Lowers a note by a half step. A flat is one of 3 accidentals in modern notation, right? Very terribly modern with our 5-line staves and time signatures and everything else. So we have sharps, flats, and naturals. There are no sharps in chant. However, there are flats, and where there's a flat, there could possibly be a natural sometimes. So, yes, that is a flat. Yes, that flat applies to the note immediately to its right, and that's the case all 3 times. Okay? Make sense? So, good. Did you have a follow-up? Okay, fair enough. All right, so let's go back down now to our notation guide. Underneath the torculus, you have what's called a Poractus. This is basically an inversion of the torculus, but it looks quite a bit different. When I was a kid, I used to call it the Nike swoosh, but it's got kind of that whoosh sort of quality to it. Those are 3 notes: high, low, high. Okay, it doesn't really look like it, but that's what that is. So you would go, in our example on our guide, it would be the top space down to the 2nd line and then up to the 3rd line, all 3 being notes. Okay, so you can go back to that same Agnus Dei that I was just singing on. And on the 2nd iteration of the Agnus Dei, over tollis. Do you see that? Agnus Dei, qui tol, high, low, high. Right? Okay. So, and a lot of people ask about that one and why it looks the way it does. And again, remembering that these were all originally written out by hand, a lot of chant notation just has to do with economy of space, as unromantic as that sounds. That's the truth. Okay, just a matter of taking up little space, especially when you're trying to fit it above a small syllable. You don't want to spread out your notes and your neumes, so you just condense it into that little Nike swoosh. Okay? Descending 3 notes, we've already seen those in a few examples. Yes, Dale. $16? You got it now? Are you maybe if you skip nap time and wake up. That's just a reference to an earlier text. Don't worry about it. Okay. Yes, descending 3 notes. Also, speaking of economy of space, sometimes people wonder, okay, some of these are squares and some of these are diamonds. What gives? It's spatial. That's really what it comes down to. You can fit diamonds in a smaller space than squares. So you have the Climacus as just a very easy descending phrase, and the diamonds take up far less space. Let's see. If you go back to the Kyrie of the Missa de Angelis, which is page 8. Luckily, your guys' copies are stapled together. My pages are all over the place. Okay, so page 8, and there's those descending diamond phrases all over the place. And some flats. That's right. One fun thing about the flat, that since we're on the topic, look at eleison, the first eleison. Do you notice that the flat is right smack dab in that middle space, but there's not a note immediately following it? Do you see that? Yeah, so you're going to actually follow that space until you see a note that falls in that space, which is the first note of the clevis, the descending 2-note figure. There is no time signature, right. So we've got things down to a science in modern notation, right? We have our time signatures, we have metronome markings, we know that adding a dot to a note adds half of that note's original value. Everything is mathematical and all figured out and easy to compute. And yeah, music is math, right? A lot of that. Chant isn't any of that. There's no time signature and there's no specific rhythmic value. There's no rule about how fast or how slow one goes. Different people take different paces with chant. So yeah, none of that applies to chant. There aren't even measure lines and measures the way that we think of it. Instead, actually talking about that, go ahead and flip that page over to page 4, and you'll see the 3 main different kinds of bar lines: quarter bar, half bar, full bar. These have much more to do with breath than anything else. They certainly don't have to do with meter or rhythm. The quarter bars are usually a subtle, hey, you might want to take a breath right now. half bars is usually indicative of a pause in the text itself. If any of you guys have lectured at Mass, you know that punctuation dictates pauses. Similar in, the text that we're chanting. You also would want to pause for comprehensive effect, dramatic effect, all of the above. So it's not just about the necessity of breathing, although that's a very important component, but it's also about transmitting the text in a way that is as understandable as possible. And some of those pauses allow for that. Full bars is a very clear total break. And then obviously when you get to the double bars, you're looking at the end of a section. So for example, in the Kyrie, it's sectioned off into those double bar lines. Okay? All right. So going back now to the final little guy at the bottom of page 3. If you look at chant, Gregorian or English, you will often notice at the very tail end of every line of music, there is this little half note guy hanging out. And it's odd, and it's usually not necessarily a syllable that you see that corresponds to that. Does anybody have an idea what that little half note is for? Do you all see what I'm talking about, first of all? Does anybody not see what I'm talking about? Okay, Pat, so any of the chant that you're looking at, doesn't matter which one, go to the very end of the staff on the far right. Do you see what looks like a little, just like half of a note, like it got cut off? Like the photocopy machine stopped working or something. Yes, the monks in the 12th century had a horrible time with their photocopiers. Any ideas? Remember when I was talking about how a giant book is what folks were reading off of to sing? They don't have individual scores. So when they get to the end of their musical line, their eyes have to go all the way from the far right to, the head would have to move to get to the beginning of the next line. So this serves as basically a little heads up, this is the next note that's coming at the beginning of the following line. So if you look at the end of every line of chant that has that little cut-off looking note, you will see that it is the exact same pitch as the first note of the following line of music. Kind of fun, a little nerdy, but kind of fun. Sorry? Yeah, it's helpful. It says this is what's coming next. Pat, the notation guide addresses the flat at the top of the next page, page 4, if you wanted to just kind of read up on that. Okay, let's talk about modes really quickly. There are 8 total church modes, so you can have chants written in any one of those 8 modes. Those of us that know music, or at least even know a little bit about music, we know that modern music is written either in a major or a minor key, right? There's the happy songs and there's the sad songs, it's major and minor. And then, of course, we've got all our different key signatures, and people who have a very keen ear can really differentiate between different keys in terms of the lightness of some and the heaviness of others. So we have all these options in modern music. Well, in chant, it is just those 8 modes, and they are not necessarily corresponding to anything major or minor per se. Every mode has its own feel, that is true. And it is also true that, as an example, mode 8 is a little bit more joyful, is a little bit more exuberant than, for example, mode 7, which is kind of a downer. But we would never refer to them as major or minor. That's not in our terminology when we're talking about chant. What you will, as you become more acquainted with chant, is you'll discover that each mode has similar cadences, for example. Ends of phrases will end in similar ways in the same modes. Also, going back to the question about the psalms that are chanted during antiphons, each mode has its own corresponding psalm tones. So some of you that are really paying attention when I'm chanting psalms will recognize some, like, oh, I've heard this psalm tone before. That corresponds to the mode. If you're wondering how you find out what mode a piece of chant is written in, you need look no further than the very beginning of each piece. So since we've been hanging out with our Kyrie from the Missa de Angelis, page 8, you'll see a little Roman numeral 5 at the very beginning. Or if you flip that same page over, page 7, the other Kyrie for our very simple Mass, mode 3. And this is true for almost everything in your handout, almost. You'll see the mode that corresponds. Mass settings that are the same Mass setting. So for example, Missa de Angelis, a lot of the parts of that ordinary will be in the same mode because sometimes there's thematic similarities, but not necessarily. You can switch modes up in an ordinary as well. Propers have different modes that are often corresponding to the text itself. Because again, more than anything else in chant, it's all about the text. Chant is almost 98% of chant, especially of chants for the Mass, is taken directly from Scripture. It's not a freely composed poem or something like that. Some of the chant hymns are poetry, but the chants of the Mass, the propers in particular, are taken directly from Scripture. And so transmitting those texts in the most effective way possible is the most important thing. So the composers of our first chants, our Gregorian chants, would take that into consideration when choosing whether the chant would be melismatic, pneumatic, or syllabic, choosing where breath marks and bar lines go and pauses, choosing whether to extend a phrase with a chalisma or move it right along with no extensions on any of the notes. All of those things come into consideration when these were being set to music for the first time. Pat? Not in the way that I think you're thinking. Like we think of Ionian mode, for example, as being a major scale, right? And an Aeolian mode is a natural minor, and that's the arrangement of the steps. No, not in that sense, no. It is much more defined by the location of do and by the cadences themselves. The presence of flats is indicative of certain modes. All of that comes into play. Good. Other questions about modes? Okay, good. So let's go ahead and look at these examples in just a little bit more detail. So, sorry, before I forget, we don't really need to spend time on this unless there are specific questions, but on page 5, you'll see a guide for Latin pronunciation. I think that a lot of us have been singing in Latin, at least in small amounts, enough that we probably don't need to spend a ton of time on it unless there is a desire to, or if there are specific questions about Latin words, or maybe there's a tricky Latin word that's always been bugging you. I don't know. No? Move right along? Okay. Okay. So, the Kyrie, we've already dealt with those. Basically what I did for this packet is I took the simple Mass setting, which is the one that we've been using for the Sundays of Lent, for example, which is actually a product, it's a hybrid Mass. You'll notice in the packet itself, the Kyrie, which is from this Mass, says it's from ordinary time during the week, but then if you swing on over to the, page 11, you'll notice it's from an entirely different Mass. But they're both very simple settings. Same is true for the Agnus Dei. They're all simple settings, and what happened during Vatican II again is the Council Fathers decided, okay, again, bare minimum, what can we ask congregations to be able to sing to get through the Latin ordinary all in one piece? And so they did this hybrid mass that's now called Missa Jubilate Deo, and it is this Kyrie, that Sanctus, that Agnus Dei, put them all together, and there you've got your very, very simple mass setting. And it's a good starting point for any parish. And I don't even know how long St. Brendan's been using it, but I would imagine quite a while because I hear people singing it all the time. So that's one. And then on the flip side of each one of those parts of the ordinary, I then put the corresponding text, but from the Missa de Angelis. And the reason I chose that setting is because that's the one that we have done here during seasons like Christmas. We sang it for those Sundays. We just sang it this morning because it's a huge solemnity today. Sang it last Friday because of the solemnity. So and the Missa de Angelis has been kind of a favorite of a lot of parishes since Vatican II. It was actually in great use in the decades leading up to Vatican II as well. So it was kind of already in parishes' wheelhouses. So it became an easy one for pastors to say, okay, let's just have that be our fancy mass. But a lot of people don't realize that there are 18 total settings of Mass ordinaries in Gregorian chant. And there's kind of Mass ordinaries for every occasion. You've got Mass ordinaries that are dedicated specifically for feasts of Our Lady. You have Mass ordinaries that are dedicated specifically for weekdays in ordinary time. Then there's Mass ordinaries for weekdays in Advent. Then there's the ordinaries for the Masses and Sundays of Advent and Lent. And then there's Masses for Commons of the Saints. So there's all sorts of occasions that Mass ordinaries were written, totaling 18 of complete sets. And then you've got your rogue pieces as well that you can kind of just extract from if you want. But yeah, so there's a lot of options actually to use if you want to, spice things up with some different settings. But for our purposes today, Missa Jubilate Deo and Missa de Angelis are the two that you're looking at. So we've already spent some time on the Kyrie in both examples, actually. Are there any questions about the Kyrie? We don't sing the Kyrie here at this parish really much at all. So if you have questions, now's a really good time to ask them. Catherine? Why? Gosh. I don't know why specifically. That is a good question. It always is, though, right? Even in the Litany of the Saints, we start off in Greek and then we switch to Latin. I don't know. Anybody know? I'm opening the floor. Anybody? I'm sorry? Yeah, but I think a question, though, is why if everything else is in Latin, why would the Kyrie be the one and only Greek piece? I don't have a concrete answer to that. I mean, I could speculate, but yeah, I don't know. It's good. Yes. We'll save that one for Father. Okay, very good. So then our next part of the Mass Ordinary is the Gloria. Now, what's really funny to me is that the Council Fathers chose this Gloria as being the Gloria for the Missa Jubilate Deo when there are, in fact, simpler settings of the Gregorian Gloria out there. When I say simpler settings, I mean settings that don't have anything pneumatic, where it is just, it's very syllabic all the way through. But for whatever reason, this is the one that they chose, and so that's what we've got here. There are different ways of singing this in different parish communities. Sometimes you'll go to parishes where the choir or schola will alternate verses with the congregation as a way of kind of not putting the burden of the whole thing on the congregation. Other places, they just sing it all the way through. I think this is familiar to a lot of us, enough that, let's see, we're not allowed to sing, but you guys could hum a little bit. I'll sing a little bit of this, and you guys can hum along just to kind of remind yourselves of how this goes. And the reason I say that is because in roughly 9 days we'll be singing it in this building. So. Gloria in excelsis Deo, et in terra pax hominibus, bone voluntatis, Lauramus te, benedicimus te, adoramus te, glorificamus te, gratias agimus tibi, propte magnam gloriam tuam. Skip down to the second to last line. Cum sancto. Cum sancto Spiritu in gloria Dei Patris. Amen. But why is it the only part of the Mass Ordinary that's in Greek? Did you text Father Wickert? Oh. No. I told the man to take the night off, so he should be not bothered. Yes. Oh, yeah. The do clef, yep. No. Nope. Do is where that little hook, so the second line down is do. Yep. Let me see if I can find a quick little example of one of our half steps. I'm sorry? Yep. Yes, but then you'd have to have F sharp for T. Does that make sense? Okay, so you're saying if do is G? Is that what you're saying? Well, it is to a degree because we're starting off, right? There's a lot of major runs back and forth. That doesn't change the fact that do is still the first pitch that's sung. So a descending triad would be a major triad in that case. With modes? Yes. Yes. Yeah. Well, and this is a point worth mentioning. A lot of people, you look at chant, and first of all, you're reading Latin or Greek, and secondly, you're looking at a very foreign-looking notation system that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's almost 100% the case that the people that struggle the most with chant are musicians, because they're so used to our other system, and even our brains are wired to think of things major, minor in terms of scales. Well, what if this was C? What if this was this? And all that's just how we're wired to think. We want to be able to tap our foot to a beat. We want all of that stuff. The people that adapt to chant with no problem are young children and non-musicians. Always. So Octavian, you're good to go. Yeah, it is. And I'm not saying it's not accessible to musicians. It certainly is, but you've got a lot more work to kind of rewire your brain as a musician. So, yes. Other questions about the Gloria? You can take this home and practice it for Easter. Okay, if you turn that page over, then you have to turn your page also, because this is a horizontal lineup. There are not all that many settings of the credo. A credo does not correspond to every setting of the ordinary. There's usually only 3 generally that are done by the parishes that even do the credo in the first place. As you can see, it is primarily syllabic. That's a lot of text to get through. But I wanted to include it in this packet because, going back to the general instruction of the Roman Missal number 41, this is one of the parts of the Mass in Latin that that we are asked to know, that the general instruction says parishes should know. So I just threw it in there so you could take a look, kind of see. You're looking at, Pat, the same sort of situation as what you were describing. With the Gloria, mode 5, a descending major triad right out of the gate, but the do clef is still that second line down. Okay? Yeah, T is flatted almost the entire way through. Good. Any questions about the credo? Yeah, Nick. Oh, that's a very good question. Can I come back to that, though, after we get through the rest? And don't let me forget. He will in about 3 minutes. We're gonna circle back to it. Yep. I go fast. You want me to like become like a chipmunk thing, you know, where like you get the record player up to like, yeah. No, I do tend to take my chanting just in general fairly fast because slow chant is just no fun. It's not very good. And again, if you sing something like the credo slowly, you're bleeding into the next mass. I mean, they're like, why hasn't mass started yet? Because we're still singing the credo. So people that are just learning tend to really take their time because they want to get every note right. But especially something that's syllabic, if it's syllabic chant, good rule of thumb is to approach it the way you would if you were speaking the text, and you take it at about that tempo. Unless you're Mary after a ton of coffee, then don't take it that fast. Okay, questions on the credo? Good. So then we have, of course, the Sanctus, same deal with the Sanctus. We've got the Sanctus from the Missa Jubilate Deo, which is the one that we all know and love, and we've been singing for all of Lent. On the other side is the Sanctus from the Missa de Angelis. Questions on the Sanctus? Okay, moving on to the, where is it? You should have the Mysterium Fidei. I don't know where my copy of it went. Is that what's next? Okay, good. Well, at least I got your stuff right. So the Mysterium Fidei is, there's only one setting of text in Gregorian chant. In English, we have 3 options, right? We proclaim your death, O Lord. Save us, Savior of the world, and yes. How does it start again? Is that the one? I'm just trying to remember the third mystery of faith. No. Anyway, point is, in Gregorian chant, you only have the one. Oh, when we eat this bread and drink this cup, we proclaim your death, O Lord. Those are the 3. So the first one, we proclaim your death, O Lord, that's the mortem tuum, which you can probably tell by the word mortem. Right? And going back again to our little friend, the Chalisma, you have an example of that on the word Domine, right? Mortem tuum annunciamus Domine, et tuam resurrectionem confitemur, donec venias. Okay, other page, when you flip that, yes. Yeah. Yeah, because there is no break in the notation. Et tuam resurrectionem confitemur. Then we have not only a comma, but a quarter bar. So that's our breath, right? And prior to that, we have the breath because we've got a half bar line. So mortem tuam, I mean, truthfully, there shouldn't even be a break between tuam and annunciamus. There, I think, typically people, it's just a natural place to break because somebody kind of has to start the ball rolling on that chant, which is me often. The cantor, right? So the cantor would start it, or the choir, and by pausing there, it kind of gives the congregation a chance to dive in. And then it's Annunciamus Domine, definite breath, because that's a half bar, and you've got a comma. Et tuam resurrectionem confitemur, quarter bar, comma, breath. Donec venias. Yeah, no. Et tuam resurrectionem confitemur. Yeah. I think it's easy for a lot of words, especially in Latin, to bleed together when they are sung on the same pitch. And sometimes it is hard to differentiate. So it's easier to see it on the page and be like, that's how that goes. But yeah, there is no break between tuam and resurrectionem. Good. Other questions on the Mysterium Fidei? Okay, flip the page over. This also I included because this is the other one that's mentioned by name in the general instruction, number 41, that the faithful should know. So here you have the setting of the Our Father. Okay. Any questions on that? No? Oh, Catherine, yes. Sanctificetur. Yep. Yeah, and memorize them. Yes. That's good, Catherine. Though, any other Latin pronunciation questions or? Oh, very good. Yeah, so that is an indication of, it can be an indication of emphasis in chant. You don't see it all the time. So it kind of varies from one edition to the next, but that can be an indication of emphasis. So you also see it at, let's see, where else? Quotidianum, nobis et dimite nobis, dimitimus. Yeah, good. That's very observant. Okay. Other questions on the Paternoster? Very good. Agnus Dei, again, you've got the very simple version that we've been doing all through Lent. Flip it over and you've got the Missa de Angelis. Yeah, Pat. What note? Oh, yeah, no, that's not in here because this was taken straight out of the Missal. So no, that's not in there. And I, off the top of my head, do not remember what mode the Paternoster is in. I should, because there's really only one version that anybody sings. Good. Other questions? Okay, so the Agnus Dei for the Missa de Angelis, which we've sung through a little bit of. Now, Nick, let's go back to your question. So, on Easter weekend, aside from the Gloria, what other parts of the Mass Ordinary will be sung? It's a very good question. So the Gloria is going to be first. primarily because in the place of the penitential rite, which is where the Kyrie would go anyway, we'll be doing the sprinkling rite, and during the sprinkling rite, you don't say any of the text of the Kyrie. Instead, there's two options. Asperges me, which is any time with the sprinkling rite outside of Easter. During Easter, vidi aquam. And so that's sung while the sprinkling rite is going on. Okay? So that takes care of that. Then, of course, the Gloria at the end of the penitential rite. And then the Sanctus from the Missa de Angelis. The Mysterium Fidei never changes. Whether we're singing the Missa de Angelis or that simplified Missa Jubilate Deo or any other setting of the Mass Ordinary, that Mysterium Fidei, that Mortem Tuum, always the same. Okay, so that'll still be in place. And then the Agnus Dei for the Missa de Angelis. So you've got the music for every, I didn't include the Vidi Aquam, probably should have done that. No, there's too many bad words in it for Lent. Anyway, you've got most of what you need for Easter. Okay, good. Any other questions? Okay, so really quickly, because I don't want to keep us much longer, that was all the ordinary. Now we're looking at propers, okay? So the propers that I chose are propers for today because I felt like that would be appropriate. So here is an example for our entrance of what we call English propers. And we specifically refer to them as English propers because technically speaking, this is not Gregorian chant. Why? Because it's not in Latin. Okay? So technically speaking, we'll just call these English propers. And even more specifically, they're called simple English propers because they are quite simple. So this is the text straight out of the Roman Missal for the entrance antiphon for the Feast of the Annunciation. And as you can see, just looking at it, it is simple, in fact. The most you have is 2 notes on a syllable. You've got the Poractus, right? You've got, very straightforward. So it's generally syllabic. Then you've got those verses that Bridget had referred to as far as verses that accompany the chant itself, taken from Psalm 119. Yes, Anna. Okay, I'm going to give you 2 answers to that. So at any given parish, the idea with this, and the reason it is so simple, is so that, yes, the congregation could join in and sing this refrain, for lack of a better term, the antiphon itself. However, at St. Brendan specifically, prior to COVID, this was being sung, I want to say it was like as a prelude, right? Yeah, Joyce will help me remember things. So yeah, we were singing it. It's a way to still incorporate the text of the antiphon, so we weren't neglecting it, but the entrance was more of a prelude, and then a hymn was sung for the entrance procession. That's here at this parish. However, that is really kind of doubling up on what the general instruction tells us to do, because it's taking a couple of options when really you're supposed to pick one of the 4 options. So this would be option 1, as outlined in the general instruction. And at a good chunk of the parishes that I've done music for or with, this would be something that the congregation might even have in their hands, this music. Not necessarily the psalm text, but just this, so that they could sing along. Or, and I've noticed this happening at this parish during COVID, people pick up on the melody quickly enough and they're able to just join in. So, yeah, it's a good question though. The Gregorian chants would just be sung by the choir or schola because they're much more involved. And as an example of that, back to our offertory. We looked at this earlier when we were talking about melismatic chant, but now let's take a look at it again. So this is Gregorian chant, and as you can see, quite melismatic. And again, this kind of goes back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier with the emphasis on text with Gregorian chant. Specifically, the idea, and this might mean something to those of you who are musicians, have you heard the phrase text painting? Text painting in music, it becomes especially popular as a a motive and tool in the Romantic era, as taking the idea of an image and giving that life through the music. So like the string section recreating the sounds of a river. Text painting. Gregorian chant does a ton of text painting, and part of what it does is it shows us those words that are the most important. The words that are like, hey, pay attention. And so one very good trick is to look for the biggest melisma. So in this one, by far, the biggest melisma is on the word Lord, Dominus, which really tells you that's the center of this whole prayer. It is, Hail Mary is very, very important, right? But the Lord is with you, and Lord gets the most weight, the most notes, the most attention. So when you see melismatic chant, look for where the melisma is and figure out what that word means, and it'll help you sort of decipher the prayer itself. This is obviously the Hail Mary. I think most of you know that already. Ave Maria, Hail Mary, right? So if you flip the page over, that's what you'll see as our offertory simple English proper. You will notice it's in the same mode, mode 8, both of these. But again, with the English, the most we have on a syllable is on the word Mary. We have a torculus, so 3 notes on the first syllable of Mary, and that's it. Everything else is 1s and 2s. Okay? Any questions on the offertory? Communion, same deal. You've got the Gregorian chant setting, Ecce Virgo. And then on the other side, the simple English setting, Behold a Virgin. Same text, same mode. One is just significantly simpler than the other. Questions on the communion? Good. So if you were at Mass this morning, you heard all these in English already. But I also wanted to show you what this could look like in Spanish. We do have a Spanish Mass here once every weekend. And I've only sung for the Spanish Mass a couple of times, but I have used the Spanish propers. It's an amazing project that they've done. You can see the website at the bottom of the page there. Just an enormous undertaking. And what these guys actually did was they took the Gregorian setting and set it to Spanish and didn't really make a lot of adaptations. So if you were to go back to our Gregorian offertory, which is back on page 19, and compare it to page 23, you'll see a ton of similarities on the notes themselves. If you just go side by side, back and forth between page 19 and page 23, Ave Maria, Dios te salve Maria. Because they basically just took the Gregorian setting and note for note put in Spanish texts and kept the melodies. So it's pretty cool in that respect. And then, if you flip to the last 2 pages of the handout, this is the Spanish setting of the communion antiphon. And this is another cool thing that they've done, where they give you actually 3 options for the communion antiphon. The first is, again, nearly note for note the Gregorian notation, just with the Spanish translation. And then 2 and 3 are increasingly simplified. So for a Spanish choir, for example, that's just starting out, or for a Spanish congregation that's just starting out, you might want to start with option 3, get that under your belt, and then maybe move up from there. So the cool thing, and this, God bless the internet sometimes, is that we have so many resources to introduce chant to a variety of different congregations, starting simple, maybe increasing the repertoire of the congregation itself, both in the propers and in the ordinary. Any questions about any of it? Yeah. So yeah, that's a good, the question is it a new thing or a new mandate to incorporate more Latin into the Mass? Right. Yeah, okay, so the ordinary in particular, right? So a couple things. First of all, we do have, so I would again refer to the general instruction, which tells us that we want the congregation to be able to sing in Latin, the ordinary in particular. But also there's two documents that I generally refer to with these sorts of questions, and there are two documents that did come from Vatican II. So they're products of Vatican II. One is called Sacra Sanctum Concilium, and the other one is Musicum Sacrum, and they both deal with sacred music and moving forward post-Vatican II. And they also emphasize that the use of Latin is to be preserved, is one of the quotes from it. And another talks about how all things being equal, Gregorian chant needs to have pride of place, is the expression. So it's not a new mandate as much as it's a way of encouraging the preservation of both the chant and Gregorian chant and Latin and the familiarity in parish communities. I think the reason that we see that more so with the ordinary is that the ordinary does say the same, so that at least we know what Sanctus, Sanctus, Sanctus means. We might not know what Ecce Virgo Concepit means, right? So rather than having the propers be sung in Latin, where it's constantly a new text every day, the ordinary, it's something that can become familiar and hopefully more ingrained in the faithful, as far as in their repertoire, like what we were talking about. So it's not a new mandate. It has been the instruction from the church all along. It's not to say that the ordinary and the vernacular is not an option. It is. And it's not as though that's no longer the case either. They're both options. But the instruction pertains particularly to Latin and to Gregorian chant. In fact, it even talks about, but in Sacra Sanctum Concilium, at one point it addresses using the vernacular in Mass, and it says, in the first place, the vernacular can start with the readings, which seems like a no-brainer to us, but that's kind of the first place. So the readings can be in the vernacular, then it talks about the directives themselves, and then some of the prayers and chants. But the ordinary is the one that it seems like the church keeps coming back to and emphasizing the Latin and the chant with the ordinary. Well, it's going to be the same from one country to the next with slight adaptations. So, I mean, you'll notice in the germ here, it'll talk about the Diocese of the United States, and there are certain, actually it's more to do with posture and stuff, that will come up here. But as far as the Latin being used, that's not necessarily diocesan as much as it is just the universal instruction. And what I think in the section that I read, would talk specifically about communities of like multilingual communities coming together, and that being yet another reason for Latin to be used. I mean, if you think about it, when we have like a bilingual Mass here, I mean, does it make more sense to do one part of the ordinary in Spanish and one part of the ordinary in English? Or does it make more sense to do those parts in Latin so that both communities are singing together? And that's kind of what that's about, what the instruction. So no, it's not a diocesan specific thing. I mean, ultimately it's still that hierarchy. We have what the church and the council fathers have given us in these documents and in the Roman Missal. And then of course we have in the dioceses themselves, if we have a specific directive from the bishop, then we have to pay attention to that, but that's not the case here. And then below that, of course, the pastor determines how the liturgy will go at his parish too. Okay? Does that kind of answer your question? Okay. Other questions? You guys have been great. Thank you so much. Have a good night. Thank you very much. Yeah, and if you have any other questions or if you were wondering about something specific in your packet, you can come see me. I'll put my mask on and we can talk. Oh, that. Yeah, at this point, so we are now right in phase 3, which at this, and Bridget's gone, I